Hey, I'm Jammer. So, hey, we're on to our second video thing. I don't know. I'm usually call this a podcast when I'm describing it to my friends or my family whenever I'm saying this, but at the same time, this is purely on YouTube. Then again, maybe at some point, what I'll do is I'll post these recordings onto iTunes or wherever it is that you can download stuff. But for the time being, I'm just calling it. You know what? I'm just going to call it a podcast for the time being, because why not? Why not jump on the bandwagon? Anyway, so last time we were talking about Roger Crowley's book, 1453. And this week we're going to sort of follow a similar pattern. We're going to be talking about a famous battle in history, but it's not going to be a little bit in the past, specifically the year 480 BCE, with the Battle of Thermopylae. And in fact, the book that I'm going to talk about today is Ernle Bradford's Thermopylae, The Battle for the West. Now, I want to talk about this book right at the start because based upon my reading of it, or based upon my quick study of the book, it's become very obvious, very clearly, or very early on, that this book is considered outdated. It's not that the information in it is bad, it's just that the information... There's been, because history is a discourse, because it's an academic study, there are literally millions of people working in the field every day. You have archaeologists that are working on sites, discovering new materials, discovering new artifacts every day. Science is dramatically changing the field because with the technology of things like carbon datings and then other varieties of experiments that I don't have on hand because I didn't prepare that. I apologize again. I promised last time I would make mistakes, but because there's so many people doing so many great things in the field, there's always new information to come forward. And Bradford's book, because it was originally published in 1980, is going to be dated in that capacity. And I will talk a little bit more about this at the very end of the video, but for the time being, I'll go ahead and jump into it. Now, the Battle of Thermopylae, like I said, takes place in 480 BCE, and it's a battle that most people probably know about, again, because of Frank Miller's graphic novel 300, and then Zack Snyder's, I'll call it a movie, because even though I like it, there's obviously problems, but YouTube is pretty much 90% 300 references in and of itself, so maybe I'll sit down at one point and do a historical, quote, historical assessment of that movie, but I'll probably just save that for my blog. But anyway, the Battle of Thermopylae is something that it's sort of entered common knowledge, even if people don't know the details of the conflict, the Persian Wars, what have you. They do at least have the knowledge of the 300 Spartans. They may not have all the context for it, but they do have a knowledge that somewhere in Eastern Europe, 300 Greek dudes fought against an army of monsters, apparently. Well, that's not really the case. Again, the Persian Wars, and again, that title in itself comes to us from Herodotus, aka the father of history. He calls it the Persian Wars, but that's largely because the Greeks won the war, so they get a chance to actually, write the actual history of it. See, the way it happened was, from the years of about 499 to 494 BCE, there was a little, not insurrection, but there was something known as the Ionian Revolt. There were numerous colonies of what we would call Greek citizens today, sort of scattered all across the Aegean Sea, and then in the region of Anatolia, what is today modern-day Turkey. The Persian Empire was, again, an empire, and the way empires typically work is they expand outward into territories. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about the Ottoman territory, or excuse me, the Ottoman Empire. Again, while there are some civilizations that are able to sort of sit in one place and sort of rest on that, the Venetian Republic is a pretty good example of this, although they did expand outward into maritime colonies, but we'll get to that in another video. Anyway, the Persian Empire was expanding outward, and they eventually moved into the territory of Anatolia, which made them come into contact with the Ionians. The Greeks are a very independent people, and they did not like the sort of what they referred to as tyranny, or they didn't like being dominated by a foreign power. Nevertheless, the Persians pushed forward. There was a lot of bloodshed, and that would ultimately result in a lot of battles. Darius the First, make sure I'm doing the right one there. Yes, Darius the First was the emperor of Persia at that point, and he was largely responsible for the sort of crushing of these Ionians, and then eventually he began to try to move into the Greek peninsula. Now, he was eventually pushed back at the Battle of Marathon. And I do intend to sit down and talk about the Battle of Marathon, the development of the city of Athens, the development of the Greek identity. But again, since these little podcasts are designed to focus on individual books, I don't have time to talk about that today, but I promise at some point I will track down a book that will talk a little bit more about those battles, and I will talk about them. In fact, when I do finally get around to reading Herodotus's The Histories, I know, I need to. It's great. I mean, you can't talk about history without Herodotus, but anyway, right now we're talking about Bradford's Thermopylae. The point is, you need to at least know a little bit about the background of it. The point is that the Greeks had fought Persia before, and at the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians effectively pushed back the Persians, and this created a sort of sense of national shame on the roles of the Persians, so much so that Darius' son Xerxes decided to try what his father had failed to do and began to again push westward. Again, the point of an empire is you try to expand. The Romans did this, the Mongols did this. Virtually every empire is built upon a period of expansion. And so this is really important because one of the focuses of Bradford's book is he tries to humanize the Persians. And that's really important and actually still a relevant conversation because, again, as I addressed at the start, most people know this battle principally through either Frank Miller's graphic novel, which is a pretty good job of leveling the Persians or at least making them appear somewhat human. Actually, very human. It's really just the character of Xerxes being a kind of vain asshole that he is. But then again, you have the issue of Zack Snyder and a lot of otherization, which I said, again, I'll get to another video. But Bradford's book is really great because he presents the Persian expansion not so much as a sort of a bloodless other tyrant attempting to quash the Greeks simply for the sake of his own desire. Again, Xerxes was an emperor. He wanted to make his empire great. He wanted to expand the realms of his empire for the might of Persia. And so Bradford does a really interesting job in his book. I have to adjust my chair so I don't bump into my desk again. He does a really good job in this book of demonstrating that Xerxes was just a monarch who was trying to do right by his kingdom. Now, the problem is that as empires expand, eventually they're going to encounter people who don't want to become part of the empire. And so Bradford focuses his book largely upon the Greek position of these people saw themselves as being, there was someone attempting to subjugate their autonomy, their agency, their sense of themselves. And Bradford points this out. Again, as always, I'm going to be reading numerous passages from this book. I'm sorry, hopefully you enjoy the sound of my voice reading. And if you don't, what are you doing here? I'm kidding. We love having you. Please stay. Please stay. I need the numbers. Anyway, he says on page 22 of his book, "The invasion of Greece, which was about to take place, was in no sense a religious war. Such a concept had hardly evolved, except perhaps among the Jews, who saw themselves as God's chosen people, destined to bring the light of their knowledge of God to the heathen by whom they were surrounded. No, what the Greeks resented above all, though almost every small area and city-state was at a variance with the other, was the assumption that any man could call himself the God-appointed ruler of all other men. What, on the surface, almost united Greece in the struggle that was to follow was the simple survival instinct. The invasion of Greece made the turbulent, brilliant people of this mountainous and largely inhospitable land aware that they shared one thing in common, a belief in the individual human being's right to dissent, to think his own way, and not to acknowledge any man as a monarch of all I survey." Now, if you grew up in the United States, or if you grew up in Europe, well, again, I can only speak for the education being raised in the United States, so I have a very Western perspective. I grew up with a very Western perspective. Again, I was taught the Renaissance, I was taught World War II, I was taught a little bit about World War I, but I received a very Eurocentric vision of world history, European history. Again, it was very Eurocentric. And one of the side effects, or I suppose one of the implications of that, is very often the Greeks are lauded as the foundation of human civilization, and human civilization at this point is usually attributed immediately into democracy. There's probably a book out there somewhere which explores how people have used and employed the Greek humanities as a way to sort of celebrate individual American autonomy, and I really hope there is, because I want to read it and see if they make a successful argument or if they don't, because I have some problems with that philosophy. But the previous quote I just cited is important because, again, you can see Bradford is really trying to demonstrate that this was a conflict where the Greeks began to create a conception of themselves And he's really trying to emphasize the traditional image of the Greeks that exists in culture. Now, again, the Greek civilization was a beautiful one. It was a really interesting one. I mean, they are, again, the foundation of most Western civilization. And they are, whether people like it or not, at least in our minds, the philosophic progenitors of democracy, the idea of the individual being. A lot of their philosophy and politics is driven in this notion. So what Bradford is trying to do, especially with this quote here, is he's trying to demonstrate that the Persian expansion was not so much just a military conflict for the Greeks. They saw in this struggle more than just the fact that they would have a ruler over them. For them, this was a matter of philosophy as well. It's not enough that Xerxes wants to take our land and make us Persians. It's the fact that he wants to appoint himself as ruler of all. He wants to make himself a god. He wants to be or is possessed by such hubris. And that offends us both as a people, as an ethnic identity, as a racial identity, just as a political identity, what have you. It is just offensive to absolutely everything in their body. And this is really important because, again, war is not simply a matter of moving men across the board, moving men across the battlefield, and having them kill each other until somebody loses. War is ultimately rooted in some kind of philosophy. It could be an economic philosophy, a personal philosophy. Oh, Lord, look at the situation of the Civil War, the conversations that take place in the United States over the Civil War. People view conflict not simply as just a matter of it's us versus them. It's more of a matter of this is our being and our essence. And I think that it's safe to say, or at least fair to say, that Bradford's really trying to demonstrate that just in that quote. Now, let me make sure. Again, sometimes I really need to sit down and really work on just a list of the quotes that I want to list off first. But what's really important in this book is that Bradford is also really trying to create the Spartans as an individual people. Because up to this point, a lot of emphasis had been placed upon the city of Athens, and fairly so. The Athenians are probably the people in Greece that people think the most about, whether they realize they're thinking the most about. Again, when we talk about Athens, we have to talk about the Aristotelians, we have to talk about Aristotle, we have to talk about Plato, we have to talk about Socrates, we have to talk about Athenian politics, we have to talk about democracy. And all of those ideas are just so ingrained in Western civilization. Bradford's quite open and honest, especially in his preface, which I'll quote later, about the fact that he really wanted to focus in on the Spartans, because he saw something really important in that. And that gets a little bit into Bradford's personal philosophy. Bradford was born in 1922 and he died in 1986. And a lot of people have pointed out that he was very much a part of, if not the greatest generation in that capacity, he was very much a part of that English system that had survived through both of the World War IIs. He had seen sort of the steady implosion of the English Empire. And one thing I'll talk about a little bit later, too, is his use of the adjective Churchillian, which, again, I'll get to it later. But Bradford really wants to emphasize the Spartans as a race of people, because, according to his preface, not a lot of historians or writers had really focused enough effort in that capacity. Now, he says on page 61 of his book, talking a little bit about how Spartan society worked. He says, these same laws also forbade him, the Spartan, from indulging in agriculture, craft, or indeed any kind of profession, except that of arms. Many military castes over the centuries have despised the tradesman or the artisan, but none has ever carried it to the level as the Lycurgus demanded of the Spartiate. To ensure that this master race maintained its sound stock, each child was examined shortly after birth by the elders, the seniors of the city. They either passed it as suitably fit or strong, or, if it was reckoned at all weakly, they had it exposed or thrown over a cliff. At 7 or 8 years of age, boys were taken from their mothers and were enrolled in a group of their year. It is not clear whether at this age he still lived at home, but, in any case, he now came under the discipline and control of a senior Spartiate. Similarly, at 13 he was transferred to yet another group under similar control, but presided over by a magistrate. Their whole life was devoted to the state. Except for this latter qualification, or the incredible harshness of their lives, it is not difficult to feel that something of the Spartan system had been ingested by the classically educated headmasters who helped form Britain's 19th century public schools. And see there, again, I had to point out that he was English, and I completely forgot about the end of that quote there. But again, you can kind of see what Bradford is attempting to do by looking at the Spartan civilization, or the way their sort of population dynamic worked. Again, the Spartans had race of slaves, which of course I can't remember their names off the top of their head, but I'll try to remember that and make sure to put it in the description section, or I'll find an article which will talk a little bit about it. But the Spartan civilization is so distinct and different from the Athenian civilization because while you can't call it a democracy in any true sense of the term, it is a society where the individual is important, but the individual is ultimately a tool of the state. It's a true sort of oligarchy, where Spartans spend their entire lives surrendering their personal autonomy for the autonomy of the city or the polis of Sparta. And that's something that's really fascinating and important. Bradford's really trying to emphasize this is what made the Spartans so unique, so incredible, and then he's also sort of setting the stage for eventually the Battle of Thermopylae itself. He wants to create the Spartan, or at least establish the Spartan in the reader's mind, as a figure entirely devoted to the polis, entirely devoted to the notion of themselves as a warrior. And that's crucial. Because again, if the summation of this book is the Battle of Thermopylae and the role the Battle of Thermopylae had to the entire Persian conflict, he needs to make sure that, or he's trying to make sure that, the reader sees why the Persians struggled so much to conquer Sparta. That gets in a little bit later to the idea that, again, Xerxes was fighting only 300 Spartans. What kind of real conflict could that be? But whatever the case, that quote is important because he's establishing the Spartan as a sort of not superhuman individual, but a warrior to sort of overcome any and all other warriors. Now, the conflict with this is because of this sort of rigorous, I'm not even going to call it military training, you could call it an entire, paradigm or personal self-paradigm, what have you. It's not even a self-paradigm at that point because there is not a complete center of self. Okay, I'm beginning to ramble now, and you just need to move on to the next quote. What I'm just simply trying to say is, Bradford, in that quote, is attempting to create the Spartans as a supreme military people. Their entire lives are dedicated to the concept of conflict, which, of course, once you get to the Persian War, ba-boom, you have conflict. Now, Bradford's book is not simply about Sparta as an institution. He dedicates a lot of emphasis and time and energy upon the city of Sparta, the people of Sparta, the entire concept of what a Spartan is, what a Spartan warrior is. But again, the entire book in and of itself is about the Persian conflict. He's going to make the final Battle of Thermopylae kind of like, if I can use a statistical term, if you have a bell curve, Thermopylae is going to be the tip of the bell curve from which everything else will sort of fall down. But as he's building up to the actual Battle of Thermopylae, he talks a little bit about the defense that Greece prepared. Because when Xerxes made the effort to invade into Greece, it's important that not every single city-state resisted him. In fact, there were several city-states that actually decided to go ahead and acquiesce. The main defense of Greece, or the main resistance from Greece, came in the form of Sparta and also in the form of Athens. Now, the Greeks were led by a man by the name of Themistocles. Now, Themistocles is a really interesting guy, and I really want to try to find a biography about him or a little bit more about him so I can talk about him in his own video, because he really deserves it. I believe Blue from Overly Sarcastic Productions, aha, I said his name already, haha. Anyway, Themistocles, Blue has a video where he talks about the rise of the Athenian Empire, and Themistocles is really important because he's the guy who helped Athens establish their navy, which would ultimately be the key to their success. I'll talk a little bit about maritime empires or thalassocracy, which is sort of the key to winning in a state is by owning the sea. But whatever the case, Themistocles sort of became the head guy in terms of the Greek resistance. And on page 90 of the book, Bradford talks a little bit about him. Part of Themistocles' strategy was inevitably dictated by the very natural Athenian suspicion that the Spartans might let them down, might rely on the defense of the isthmus, you can tell I'm a little dehydrated, might, for whatever given reason, procrastinate and turn up late, as they had done at Marathon. If the worst came to worst and northern Greece was overrun, the Spartans might come to the conclusion that they could stay secure in the Peloponnese. They and the other allies had to be convinced that, on this occasion, it was all or nothing for every state which had declared to hold their ground against the might of the invader. For the first time in their history, the Greeks had to learn to cooperate with one another. In only one respect did the Athenians have an advantage over the Spartans. if Attica fell and Athens was overrun, they would, even if worsted in a sea battle, still have some ships left. The survivors could do a Dunkirk, and, after collecting women and children from Troezen, they could abandon Greece, sail south and then west across the Ionian Sea, and plant a new colony in Sicily or Italy. The Spartans, with their small fleet, were condemned to fight on land with no escape. Now, in that paragraph, you have a lot of things that Bradford is attempting to do. First of all, he's trying to sort of provide you with the actual facts of the matter. Themistocles' strategy was dependent upon the idea that you could not just have a land battle. Greece, if you know anything about its terrain, is a very mountainous country. There are some flat planus, official new word, planus. Somebody contact Oxford English Dictionary. Greece is predominantly a hilly, rocky region, and so in terms of a land battle, Greece just could not defend itself through that capacity. There are some nations that have used their mountainous terrains to great effect in terms of their personal defense, but Greece just didn't have that capability. Themistocles was really smart in realizing that, yes, we have mountains, but if we have a stable naval defense, there's absolutely no way that the Persians can entirely beat us in that capacity. And if they do, at the very least, if we create a navy, we can at least create a colony somewhere else, and then maybe at some point try to come back and reclaim our lands. Now that speaks a little bit to the importance of logistics, the importance of contingency plans, and it speaks a little bit to Themistocles as an individual person realizing that, hey, even if we lose, we have the capacity to escape. And if you also observe, there's kind of a little bit of a spite there because, haha, we're Athens, and so even if we don't make it, or even if we lose, the Spartans are left on land. But at the same time, that also reveals, I think, a fundamental brilliance on Themistocles' part, because he understands right off the bat that in terms of actual physical warfare, Athens just could not compare to Sparta in any capacity. The Spartans were literally bred to fight. It was their entire locus of being. And so at that point, Themistocles is demonstrating his brilliance as a general, as a leader, because he knows what units to place and where. Now, I also wanted to point out, again, one of the interesting things about this book is you can really see how not dated it is in this capacity, but if you observe the reference to Dunkirk consistently throughout this book, Bradford is throwing out these little references to World War II. Like, you could just hear the English conservatism, you could hear the sort of, even just, how you say, the Englishness period. He's a man who's clearly lived through World War II, and he's going to use that experience in terms of writing his history. And this probably has a little bit of emphasis to play if you ever take like a historiography course or even just a graduate level history course. You're going to talk a little bit about what is the man's methodology, how is he approaching writing, what is his bias. And again, Bradford was noted for being a bit of a conservative, for being falling back upon the sort of English conservatism. He's a man who's going to use his experience, or at least his perception and his experience, to write his history. And so constantly throughout these books, there are just these little references to World War II that, while not distracting and not galling, they just sort of take you out of it for a moment and makes me go like, what? Bradford, what is it? Did you really just use the adjective Churchillian in here? Did you really just use Dunkirk to describe? Okay, fine, yeah, whatever. But whatever the case, it's just one of these little things that makes Bradford's book very unique and of its time. Now, I wanted to bring in this point of Themistocles' strategy to really come into, or really touch on the fact that the Spartans and the Athenians, as they prepared their defense, really understood what their roles were. And just as important, while the title of the book, Thermopylae, The Battle for the West, makes it seem like the book is going to be purely about the Battle of Thermopylae, what's really interesting about this book is that Bradford places the actual battle itself right in the middle of the book. He is ultimately attempting to make Thermopylae the sort of climax of the book itself, but he's trying to build it and then immediately use the Battle of Thermopylae to explain everything that happens afterwards. The Battle of Thermopylae itself, while incredibly important, really served more as a distraction, and I believe the last quote that I was going to put in here talks a little bit about that. I'm sorry, you're going to hear me click my tongue here a little bit. Okay. I didn't mark it, so I'm not going to sit here in silence trying to find the right quote. But he talks a little bit later about, ultimately, the use of the Battle of Thermopylae was to serve as a larger distraction for the Battle of Salamis. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I apologize if I am. But Salamis was the battle, a naval battle, in which... Make sure I'm using the right name of this person. I have to write... Made sure this time to write down... Yes. Sorry about that silence there for a sec. I actually wrote down notes of people and dates this time to make sure I got it right. But Themistocles led the Athenian navy, which was fighting the same time at the Battle of Thermopylae. And so while Xerxes' efforts were centered on the Battle of Thermopylae, Themistocles was leading a major fight against Xerxes' navy at the Battle of Salamis, and it's really the victory and really the efforts of this battle that gave the Greeks all of the advantages that they eventually did receive. And so I think what's really interesting about this book is that he really emphasizes that even in hindsight, we place so much emphasis upon Thermopylae as the key decisive battle in the Persian conflict, when in fact, really, the Battle of Salamis was far, far, far more important strategically. Now, I'm going to be completely honest here, and I apologize as always, but I don't know anything about the Battle of Salamis. Like, I just don't. I was never really taught it growing up in school. I was taught about the 300 Spartans, which, again, 300 Spartans stood up against an entire army, and it was actually several thousand individuals fighting together, but you did have a band of Spartans which played most of the sort of strategic... not strategic. They played a central role in the battle. There's actually a lot more people there. But growing up, I was never really taught about Themistocles and the Battle of Salamis. I was never really taught about the Battle of Plataea. I mean, I received a little bit of information about it, but honestly, not much. It was just sort of the Greeks finally beat Xerxes, and that's it. Again, one of the really important or interesting things about Bradford's book is, as far as I can tell, it's one of the few books of history that really tackle the Battle of Thermopylae with a lot of depth to it. And honestly, after the Battle of Thermopylae, while I did read the rest of the book and I did enjoy the rest of the book, I'm going to be honest, I wasn't able to process a lot of the material because I just haven't had enough experience with that information. It's something that I do intend to track down a book that covers nothing but the Battle of Salamis, and I promise as soon as I do and as soon as I read it, I will talk about it on this site. I'll write a review of it for my site, Tower Musings. But until such time, I'm just not going to try to cover it in this video because I'm really roughing it. Now again, I'm going to make sure I post a link to it in the description section, but Blue of Overly Sarcastic, again, he has a video where he talks about the Greek Empire, and he actually not the Greek Empire, really the Athenian Empire, and so he talks about these battles and their lasting relevance. And so, like I said, I'll post it in the description, and I would definitely recommend you check it out because it's a great video, and I'm just going to continue to plug Blue as much as I can because I just think he's awesome. But moving back to Bradford and his book Thermopylae, right in the middle of the book, he talks about the actual Battle of Thermopylae. And I will admit, I was a little disappointed because the actual battle itself takes place over the course of, at most, 3 or 4 chapters. And even then, you're looking at an expanse of maybe 50 pages. Which, I know some people, 50 pages is a lot. But if you're somebody like me, who regularly is reading like almost all the time, you're just kind of like, but the title's Thermopylae. Where's the Thermopylae, dude? I came here for the Thermopylae. Man? Okay. Well, alright, so, Thermopylae. What happened? Well, you probably know the story already, but King Leonidas of the Spartans situated himself into a territory known as the Hot Gates. It was a very, very small mountainous valley region where the Persians did not have the advantage of their numbers. Again, the valley sort of cones into a very, very thin space. And if you know anything about Greek warfare, the Greeks relied on a hoplite formation. And what that is you have basically a brick or a block of dudes. At the very, very front, men would hoist up or hold up a massive bronze shield. It was usually a bronze shield. Some of them are going to be made out of wood with a bronze exterior, but you're talking about a really heavy-duty shield. And while they're using their left arm to hold up the shield, the right arm would be holding a spear. Now, at this point, most of the sort of Greek hoplite spears, you're looking at about 9 feet long. When you get to Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, that 9-foot-long spear is going to be extended, I believe it's up to 23 feet long. It's ridiculous. But the way it would work is you would just have a row of men holding their shields and their spears. And on the very, very end of that, you would have essentially the exposed side. Now, you usually have your best dudes at the very end, or the very far right side. That way, the exposed weakness there isn't a weakness. People would rush at the hoplite formation. The men would hold up their shields, and if the enemy was able to push through those spears, the Greeks would then bash them with their shield and then stab with their spears. Now, on top of their shoulders are usually the men behind them holding up their spears, who would then also be using them to just jab forward, and then on top of that, you might have a couple more spears. If a man fell during the battle, another man would walk forward and assume the position. This was an incredible unit. It was incredibly efficient. It was largely because of the position they had in the hot gates. The Persians just met with a solid wall of the Persians just met a solid wall of Spartan dudes who had literally spent their entire lives training to fight, to kill, to ignore pain. The only sort of, you could maybe say these guys were like up against a wall of Marines, but again, it's always tricky comparing modern military units to ancient military units. The point was, the Spartans were an incredible fighting force, using an incredible military formation in the exact right spot. Xerxes' men were just crushed and defeated. And Bradford actually has a great quote where he talks a little bit about it. On page 126, he starts, "The Medes were commanded by Tigranes and Achaemenid." Again, I really need to read these names before I actually read the quotes. "Were equipped in the same manner as the Persians, who had indeed adopted it from Medes in the first place. They wore dome-shaped helmets with hammered bronze or iron, a jacket of fish scale mail with a sleeved embroidered tunic over it, long trousers, and carried light wicker shields." Now, these are the Persians. Again, listen to everything that I had just said beforehand, and then picture that against the Persians, who had wicker shields. The arms consisted of short spears, a dagger, and bows with a quiver full of short arrows. Although admirably suited for a certain type of warfare in the mountains or in deserts or in the great plains of Asia, such protection and such armament was woefully inadequate against the hoplite line which they were now about to encounter. Those were brave men indeed who now moved forward against the wall of huge bronze shields, the intimidating and highly protective helmets, the bronze cuirasses and leg guards which gleamed defiantly as they advanced across the plain and into the defile. It was true that the Persian shower of arrows might, quote, darken the sun, at advance report, about which one Spartan had remarked, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." But when it came to close-quarter work, as it must, the weapon that would be dominant was the long Greek spear. The fox had many tricks, and the hedgehog one good one, and at the hot gates the bristling hedgehog would prove more than formidable. When you're fighting against men, the hoplite unit, which was arguably one of the most heavy units of the ancient world, if not the entirety of the ancient world at this point, facing off against men who were armed with small spears, daggers, and wicker shields, the Persians just couldn't compete. Now, ultimately, the Spartans would be betrayed, and there was actually a secret pass behind them which would allow the Persians to eventually flank them and then slaughter them all. But again, Bradford is keen to note in a later passage that even when the Persians had the superiority of a flanked maneuver, they still could not beat the Spartans in that capacity. And in fact, King Leonidas and his men were eventually brought down by a hail of arrows rather than an actual physical contact. The Spartans, to their last breath, fought to their last man. And Bradford does an amazing job of demonstrating the bravery of it. King Leonidas appears as an incredible leader. It's a wonderful, wonderful passage that only lasts 50 pages. So, King Leonidas and his 300 men are dead, just mowed down by a sea of arrows. The Persians, these foreign invaders, are victorious. And then there's another 100 pages of book which describe the Battle of Salamis, the Battle of Plataea, and then the long-lasting emphasis of the battle and why it was important. And look, I'm going to be real. I mean, after the Battle of Thermopylae itself, there wasn't a lot to the book that immediately appealed to me. I learned a lot. I did. To be fair, I really did. There were a lot of great passages in this book, and there were plenty of moments where I was just left spellbound by the writing itself. But at the same time, by the end of a book, we do have to ask ourselves, so what? What is the significance of this book? And I think you kind of get a sense of it on page 148, when Bradford appears to sort of be crafting his final thesis. On one passage he notes, "In the past, it was a natural human tendency to elevate the Battle of the Hot Gates to an almost superhuman dimension and, having done so, to let the purpose of it be forgotten. Quite unlike Dunkirk," there again, he's using Dunkirk, "which was a withdrawal, Thermopylae was a deliberate self-sacrifice by a handful of men who died so that the fleet at Artemisium might stay in being. The very fact that, on the same day as the storming of the pass, Xerxes gave order for his fleet to attack the Greeks proves how important to his strategy was the shattering of this linchpin." So right off the bat, even Bradford seems to understand the fact that the Battle of Thermopylae has often been seen as kind of like the superhero battle of gods against this kind of like other horde of just almost subhuman creatures. And so you can get into the conflict right off the bat of, well, there's a lot of, quote, Orientalism taking place there. Orientalism, by the way, is the sort of principle where people in the West look upon the people of Asia, the Middle East, as these kind of like subhuman creatures. And I'm going to talk about that again at the very end of this book. But he's keen to point out, again, the Battle of Thermopylae was not the whole show of the Persian conflict. It's become kind of the whole show as we've sort of mythologized the Spartans and turned them into just these super ripped, incredibly Scottish and English for some reason, just godlike men who were able to take on the entirety of Persia themselves. But as he points out, Thermopylae was just one part of the battle. I mean, it was... Again, it was a self-sacrifice because King Leonidas seemed to understand at that point that he and his men were fighting to the last man, but ultimately they were going to help all of Greece by doing so. But Bradford says a little bit later on what the Battle of Thermopylae, in fact, what the Persian War did for Greece overall. He says, "For the first time in their history, a distinct sense of Greekness, far overriding the almost eternal and fratricidal squabbles of their city-states, served to unite this brilliant people." Now, he goes on to say that this was not a complete unity, and Greece did not do anything in the way of assuming a nationalism as we in the 21st century would sort of understand it. But that quote is, I think, absolutely everything to this book. Again, as I said in the previous video, the purpose of history is to tell a narrative using the events of the past, and then ultimately good history is about let's observe a trend of behavior that took place in the past and come to some sort of understanding of it. What is the immediate real-world relevance of it, and does it impart, I won't use the word moral lesson, because when I think of morals, I think of all those awful He-Man episodes I've watched growing up, or in my case, a lot of those VeggieTale episodes. Ugh, youth. But good history is about trying to look at the events of the past and see what relevance or what lesson could this teach us today. And so looking at Thermopylae, the battle for the West, Bradford is attempting to demonstrate that the Persian War performed an important task because up to this point, Greece was largely a collection of highly independent city-states, independent polis, who were constantly fighting and warring. The Athenians hated the Spartans hated the Athenians, you had Corinth and Thebes and all these little individual places that didn't, I'm not going to say that they were constantly fighting, but there was no sense of unity among them. They did not see themselves as a total Greek race of people. Spartans saw themselves as Spartans. Athenians saw themselves as Athenians. Thebans saw themselves as Thebans. It was not Greece as an identity. What happened in the Persian conflict, though, was because of the attempted invasion of Xerxes, Greeks began to see themselves as Greeks. They were able to overcome their differences for the larger good of the nation of Greece. Now, unfortunately, one of the side effects of this conflict was Athens would begin to develop their navy, and they would sort of develop their own sort of empire, and then there would be further conflicts between them. I mean, again, let's not pretend that suddenly everything was lovey-dovey and Teletubby episodes, okay? This was still individual peoples who still had that sense of individualness. New word, again. But again, the Persian conflict united Greeks, so that even if they still didn't like each other, even if they still didn't trust each other, they still saw in one another allies who were possessed by the same idea of, this is Greece. Even if we disagree about how we are to live our lives, we still agree it's our lives to live, and no one should dictate what that is. And so you see not the stirrings or the beginnings of a national identity, but at least the stirrings, perhaps, of an ethnic identity that would then eventually continue on. And so I really wanted to end, I think, on one last quote, because while there are still numerous other quotes in the rest of the book, it's really in the preface where you sort of get Bradford trying to create or sort of state his goals and aims purely. He says on page 14 of his preface, "While researching the history of this momentous year, I found that, among the numerous scholars who had published full-length works and many a learned treatise, nearly all seemed to share one thing in common. This was a natural and, to my mind, inevitable pro-Athenian bias. As says later on, the last stand of King Leonidas and the Spartans was told as a golden story in my youth. Since then it would seem to have been downgraded, perhaps because their military outlook and stubborn courage have made them unattractive to a hedonistic society. Without courage, man is nothing. Without the Battle of Thermopylae, that pass held against all odds, there would never have followed Artemisium, Salamis, and Plataea. Distasteful though it may have been to later historians preoccupied with Athens, it was very largely the generalship of the Spartan Pausanias that made the victory of Plataea possible." And that, I would argue, is probably one of the most important aspects of the book. Again, I addressed at the start, the Battle of Thermopylae is something that has sort of entered into common knowledge, so that even if people who don't have degrees in history, who have never read anything about ancient Greece, they somehow know 300. And again, that gets into the endless pop culture references that have sort of sprung forward. You have Frank Miller's graphic novel, which I would argue is actually a fairly real and honest and unashamedly a pretty positive treatment of the actual Battle of Thermopylae. I mean, despite some little details that he sort of introduces for dramatic effect. Frank Miller's book is actually pretty solid, and in the back of his book he has a small list of resources, or a small list of books that he says further reading for anyone interested, and one of the first books on here is Ernle Bradford's Thermopylae. When I was doing, excuse me, getting a little dehydrated doing all this talking. I know, shorter videos, I know, I can't not talk. Anyway, when I was doing research for this book, I was trying to find any other book to see if there's anybody else who had tried to talk about just the Battle of Thermopylae. And unfortunately, there doesn't really seem to be anyone else who has. There was one author whose work I'll try to put in the descriptions if I can remember it. But other than that, not a lot of people have focused. Now, it's entirely likely a lot of work has been done, and that unfortunately we're just stuck behind this endless paywall of academic writing, which is, or excuse me, academic peer-reviewed journals, which are stuck behind paywalls. But that's oh my gosh, that's a podcast in and of itself. We're not going to talk about it right now. But Ernle Bradford's book was a resource for Frank Miller's 300, which in turn was an inspiration for Zack Snyder's film. And again, I do like the film, despite the fact that it takes history and makes it into, I don't know. I do not know. But whatever the case, the film and the graphic novel have popularized the Battle of Thermopylae. It sort of mythologized the Battle of Thermopylae and turned the Spartan men into more than just an assemblage of warrior-class people who were defending a pass for a larger strategic strategy. Part of the aspects of humanity that is unchanging and unending is we as a species love stories. We love symbols. And even though I hate allegories, we love allegories. We love moral lessons. We like to take things and turn them into larger ideas. And so the Battle of Thermopylae has sort of become that. A lot of times, the rhetoric of the Battle of Thermopylae is that, The Spartan men were fighting for democracy, for individual liberty, for the right of people to live their own independent lives. Xerxes becomes a kind of symbol for everything that is tyranny, everything that is almost fascism, everything that is power in the most corrupt form possible, which I think is really unfair to Xerxes, and I want to do on its own video just entirely dedicated to him, because Bradford himself actually does a pretty good job of humanizing Xerxes, and it's my weakness here as a reviewer for not providing any quotes that really dig into Xerxes as an individual man who is just trying to lead his kingdom forward. But, yeah, anyway, the point is, the Spartans have largely been sort of superheroed, if that is another verb that I've just made up during this video. But when he talks about the fact that when his youth, Spartans were told as kind of a golden story in the face of the sort of pro-Athenian bias, I think that's a really important distinction. Because again, we look to the Battle of Thermopylae now as a sign of what is good. We look to the Battle of Thermopylae as an indication of integrity. And so Bradford's book, even if it is dated, I think is still pretty relevant to talk about, because even if there's a lot of aspects of his history that have become, if not outdated, then at least updated by historians, his history is still a really interesting argument and conversation that we're still having today. So even if historians themselves can't rely upon it as a solid source, I think it's still incredibly relevant in terms of our culture. Why do we look to the Battle of Thermopylae as an indication of everything that is good about individual human integrity? And I think in that way, Bradford's Thermopylae is going to continue to be a lasting document until somebody writes something just as good or even better. Okay, so that's the content of the book itself. Now, immediately afterwards, again, being a history enthusiast, not a true historian here, I always want to make sure that I'm doing something, or at least trying to make sure that there's an element of historiography to these podcasts or these videos, so that we can still say, okay, he makes a lot of good points, but what is his methodology? What is his approach? And so I did want to talk a little bit. Okay, we need to talk about two things. He continually uses Churchillian. He uses it at least twice in the book as an adjective, and he uses Churchillian in reference to King Leonidas in terms of the Athenian military. He's constantly referring to that. And it's not a bad trick. It's just like I said before, it really reveals his bias in a way that's not distracting, but it does definitely take me out of the effect that he's trying to create. And so these constant references to World War II are not a weakness of the book, but they are definitely revealing facets of him as a writer. The thing that I do feel definitely hurts this book is the constant use of the word Oriental. And I used it earlier with the use of the word Orientalism. That's based on an actual concept in historiography and actually in terms of literary analysis as well. Orientalism is this concept that figures in the West are typically use the Asian individual or the Asian culture as an other in order to sort of prop themselves up. And if you've ever watched like the old Johnny Quest cartoon, Haji was definitely a effect of that. If you've ever read a lot of Victorian era poetry or writing, you'll probably hear the phrase "the wonders of the Orient." It's a concept that is just, it really has fallen on hard times, and rightfully so. We're learning more and more, or as globalization is moving forward, we're encountering more of the world, and we're recognizing each other's humanity. And so, unfortunately, Bradford is definitely outdated because he will constantly refer to the Persians as an Oriental race. And I know there are a lot of people out there that do not like political correctness, but the fact of the matter is that right off the bat, he's not using Oriental really in any kind of positive fact. He's using it very much in a pejorative fashion. Excuse me. There's a lot of instances where he will use the term Oriental as a means of denigrating the Persians or a way to other them from the Greeks. Constantly throughout this text, the Greeks are sort of almost high European figure. They become the face of everything that is good about Western liberty and democracy and agency. And so even though Bradford is constantly trying to say that he's attempting to level the playing field and make sure that the Persians are not just these other people, his writing unfortunately falls back upon that. Now again, I said he was born in 1922 and he died in 1986, so I think this definitely is just a facet of he's just part of a different generation with a different paradigm concerning race and language and the applicability of such. But it is important to talk about if we are going to continue to use his history as something relevant. You could say that the use of that particular terminology automatically discredits him, and again, that is entirely you as an argument. I look at this and I think to myself, ew, gross, dude, ugh, really, why? But he still makes a lot of really important points, and so I feel that while that particular terminology is disgusting and repulsive, and I really wish it wasn't in the book, it's just something we have to acknowledge. His history is solid, but unfortunately he's often revealing himself. Now, there's another aspect. He does provide a bibliography in the back of his book, but it's a very scant bibliography. It's barely even a page long. It's barely even half a page. And one of the things I had a problem with it is the fact that there's not any, he doesn't employ any sort of footnotes or afternotes. Now, that's where you're getting into the sort of nitty-gritty, nitpicky details of sort of contemporary academic writing versus popular historical writing. And in fact, again, since Bradford died in 1986, he passed, I'm not necessarily going to say he passed before the advent of such sort of necessary credentials or necessary references, but it does, again, date his work in a particular fashion. This is something I'm going to talk about, I think, later on, because lately I have been looking at Mark Kurlansky's book, Salt, which is not necessarily reviled, but definitely lauded by a number of historians, largely because it's considered what's known as pop history, and looking at his methodology in terms of citing his sources, there almost is none. Bradford sort of follows the same thing. He provides a bibliography in the back to show that he is using sources, ranging, of course, from Herodotus, and even like his first one, well, no, the first source is actually Aeschylus in and of itself. But he does, for example, have one book, A.R. Byrne, Persia and the Greeks, London, 1962. So at the time, he's using, at least by his time period, more contemporary sources. But there's nothing to indicate to the reader where those sources are actually coming from. And so if we are looking at this in terms of historical methodology, his work is definitely dated to this capacity. He does provide a good, solid bibliography so that we know what sources he's using. He does have an actual method. It's just not what we're accustomed to today. And so if you're going to rely on Bradford, please recognize that, or if you're going to appreciate Bradford as a historian, you have to recognize that his work is dated and not up to date. And then, of course, I know I did this in the last video, it might just become a bit for me, but most importantly of all, he provides an index. I love indexes so much, and my God, oh, it's such a beautiful index. It's beautiful, it's perfect. Just the use of Athen and Athens, I should have counted it up beforehand, but he provides you an index that is almost perfect. I wish he did what more sort of contemporary researchers do, and so if you have like Athens, it appears, by the looks of it, somewhere close to like 100 to 200 different times in this book. He doesn't provide you sort of specific instances, like one point it's like Athenian Popular Assembly, cooperation with Sparta, Congress of Corinth. He does that for a couple, but then a lot of times it's just 174, 177, 180, 186, and I know there's a lot of people out there who's like, who cares, it's just an index, but indexes matter. Damn it. If you're writing a paper, or if you're a nerd like me, you're like, yeah, okay, I get that, like, the Persia and Persians are, like, 400 or 500 different places in this book, but could you provide me a little bit of context? So, his index is, again, not bad. Again, this is probably just an instance where Bradford is just a little dated in this capacity, but again, final summation, Ernle Bradford's Thermopylae, The Battle for the West, is an important book, and as it's still one of the few, like, again, go-to resources for the Battle of Thermopylae, for the Persian conflict in terms of, like, contemporary history books, it's a book that we're still going to keep talking about. Like I said, while I was researching this, I really couldn't find a lot of other, I guess you could say, more contemporary books which talked about it in a very approachable and in some way non-academic fashion. Now, again, academic books are important, and I do intend to talk about it here. In fact, I'm actually at the moment working through Civic Ritual and Renaissance Venice by Edward Muir. But in terms of an actual history, Bradford's Thermopylae, The Battle for the West, is a reliable source. It is a good history. There are most definitely problems in terms of his methodology. There's most definitely some issues for me in the fact that he makes Thermopylae the center focus of the book and then doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on it. And again, his use of non-politically correct language, while it is very much just a side effect of his particular generation, his particular time, it's still an unfortunate side effect of living in our current period. We have to acknowledge it for what it is. But Bradford's book is effective because it is a text which has influenced individuals who have taken the Battle of Thermopylae and turned it into a larger cultural rhetoric. And so, if we are going to have the conversations about what is the Battle of Thermopylae, why does it matter, why was it significant, is it truly a demonstration of people fighting for their individual integrity, for their agency, for their liberty, in the face of democracy, period? Is that an accurate history? And I think Bradford's book does a good job of celebrating the Spartans and celebrating their role. But he does, through this book, demonstrate that, yes, the Battle of Thermopylae, while it was something great, it was great for an entirely different reason. It was largely the sacrifice of these men that made the Persian War the ultimate success that it was. And so, while integrity and agency and liberty and all of these beautiful, wonderful worlds do matter, we might be focusing on the wrong part of the fight. Alright, so I think that's it. I just wanted to thank you all again for watching. Again, I've also written a review of Bradford's book for my site, Tower Musings. Like the last one, I don't know if it will be posted by the time I get this video up and running. It could take a little while, but as soon as I do, I'll make sure to post it in the links. Also, again, I would definitely recommend you to check out Blue's video about the Athenian Empire, because he does talk about the Battle of Thermopylae, but he also has another video where he teams up with Shad of Shadiversity to talk about Greek warfare, the use of the phalanx formation, what have you. And so I will definitely point you in the direction of that video as well. I've also, of course, posted a link to Amazon where you can purchase Bradford's book if you should be so inclined, and I would definitely recommend it. I also didn't do this last time, and I really should since I work in one, but don't forget, you also live in a country where public libraries are a thing, so pop into your local library, see if they have a copy of it, and if they don't, a lot of libraries, like my own, offer online resources. You might find an ebook version of this. Check it out. Bradford's book is great, and it's worth talking about. As always, too, thank you for your time. Definitely, if you get a chance, subscribe and like us. Everything we can do for the channel will be great. And, well, later.